Hej, välkomna allihopa, gamla och nya vänner. Och vi har börjat, Filip och jag, vi träffas i 79 i Småland, i Orrefors, när vi båda två åkte, Filip från Amerika, jag från Schweiz, att lära oss blåsa glas och arbeta med glas. Så det är en lång historia och vi älskar Sverige och det är influenser av Sverige har tagit för våra arbete. Och jag ska tacka Elin och Anna, Galleri Glas, för det opportunity att visa vårt arbete med dem. Det är det andra utställning med Galleri Glas. Det första var i 2019 och nu är vi tillbaka. Och Filip ska göra en presentation för våra arbete, men det koncentrerar mest för de sista 10 år sedan vi har flyttat till Wales. Och jag hoppas att ni tycker om det. Och efter talet, vi ska gå till galleriet och ha en glas champagne och titta på utställning om ni vill så gärna komma. Tack!
Du vet, jag har kommit dit till Sverige 6 månader innan Monica. Efter hon var där kanske 3 veckor och hon pratade bättre svenska än jag.
Ja, men...
It's not fair. Jag är en amerikaner och Monica är en schweizer. It's normal. So we'll switch over to English, and we're gonna do the first 35 years of our career in about 5 or 6 slides. Bing, bang, bong. And then we're going to tell you about our adventure in Wales, because it's a little different. Okay. Good. So we opened our first studio. We were in Småland for a little over 2 years, and we were incredibly lucky because we went to the Orrefors Glass School, and simultaneously we got to work with Vilke Adolfsson and Anne Wolf, then Warf, in their studio that they opened together in Steinhütte. So we were privileged to get this unbelievable grounding, not only about glass blowing, but also about fundamentals of art and design. And we were in a bit of a hurry, so after 2 years, we went off to Switzerland and opened our first studio. And in the beginning, our studio was really what you would call a production craft studio. And we made, in production, all sorts of things, wine glasses, pitchers, champagne flutes, candlesticks, all those sorts of things. And we did that for a good 15 or 18 years. Bit by bit, getting into more individual works, more one-of-a-kind and special pieces. This is an early example of our first experimentation with Italian cutting techniques, battuto. It was actually Lino Tagliapetra who came to our studio 2 or 3 times, and we worked together. And it was Lino who said, you should experiment with Italian cutting techniques, which of course were made famous in the 30s and 40s with Carlo Scarpa in Vanini. And those techniques have become fundamental to our signature, shall we say, for all our work, nearly going all through the subsequent years. This piece we're showing because it's one of our favorites, and we had a group of about 50 American collectors coming to this was made in Paris, in our second studio in Paris, and we were getting the studio ready for this visit, and a lamp came down from the ceiling and smashed that piece into smithereens about 15 minutes before the people arrived. And that's glass. This now we're up to about just a little bit before the terrible recession in 2007 or 8. And my mother, we were visiting my parents for Christmas in the US, and my mother was always very diligent about doing Christmas stockings and that kind of thing. And she put this little Maine pea pod, which is a classic fisherman's dory for lobstering, in one of our stockings. And we were very impressed with this shape. And we used that shape to explore and expand a whole series of work based around boats. There's an example in the gallery next door that you can see after the show. And we began at first filling these boats with amphora because we were trying to weave together a little bit our own story, which is very much tied in with sailing and boats and the whole idea of nomadism, because we are nomads. So it's a sort of a cross between commerce with amphor and people. And these shapes, which are using the incalmo technique, which is another Venetian technique which is very germane to our work. As again you see in the gallery, there are many of those kinds of pieces. These all actually do date from Wales, but we get to the punchline here. You'll find it hard to believe, but those beautiful pieces, or we think they're beautiful, they're called the thank you, Monica. And it's actually meant as a single piece and sold as a unique sculpture, and is a riff on the number 7, which has a lot of magical implications throughout civilization. But those pieces were made in that shed. And we'll pause there for a minute because now we get a little deeper into the story. That picture dates from 2014, and we had decided to leave our studio in Paris. We were 20 years in Switzerland and then 15 years in Paris, and we loved Paris and still do, but we were ready to get back to the countryside. And we found this funky old farm in a fairly empty part of Wales. And there are actually six buildings on the farm representing about 6 centuries of architecture, this being early 20th century. And we transformed this old shed into our studio. And that's the hot shop. In one end of the studio, you're standing in our office space design area in the front, and on the other side of where you see the windows is the cold shop where we do all the cutting. So here we are. It took about a year and a half to get all that up and running, and we were landed, and it wasn't an easy transition. We were a little bit blue about the movers dropped our furnace on the sidewalk in Paris. So it was a beautiful furnace that we'd always had and maintained, and we had to build a new furnace, and we were kind of like, what have we done moving here and taking all this on? And we got a phone call from a gallery in Edinburgh called Gallery 10. And the gentleman was very nice, and he said, I know you've moved to the UK, and I'd love to work with you and do a show with you. And we said, oh, that's very nice. And he said, you can go on our site and look at the gallery. Well, the gallery was about a third or at most half the size of the beautiful gallery next door, and it was mostly full of paintings and prints with a little bit of glass. And we said, I'm terribly sorry, but this isn't appropriate. And he was persistent. He said, well, wait a minute. He said, I get it about the gallery, but maybe I can find a special space for you. And we said, sure, we're open to anything. Well, he called back 24 hours later, and he said, would the cathedral do? And we said, yeah, it might. And so we checked out the cathedral, and we had a show at St. Mary's Cathedral in Edinburgh. This is a boat that actually we had done, whatever, 4 or 5 years earlier for an exhibition in a museum in Geneva.
2012.
What?
2012.
Quite. 2012, and this is now 2016. And we showed the boat in Edinburgh. It's actually now in a museum in Switzerland where it has its own room, and it's a nice home for it. So what was special about all of this for us was, first of all, it was this giant space which demanded these installations mostly beyond anything we'd ever done before, but it also involved communicating with what can only be described as a difficult space. And so we attempted to do things that would work in that space. That's a mobile that's, I think, 12 meters in length, and we managed to get it up there from the nave. I'm not going to show you many pieces from this show. This is a frame 3 meters by a little, I think, 1.5 meters. Here again you have it all full of amphor, which is what we began to use a lot in making our boats. And we actually donated that piece to the cathedral, and it hangs there today. So, oh yes, one more piece. It's 2016. This was a big departure to do this exhibition. And we'd been thinking for some time that we wanted to include in our work more of an engagement with the social and cultural issues of our era. So we did this piece, and it's obviously a bit of antiquity. And the middle one, it's called Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow. We can't pretend that it's a very optimistic vision, but it's a vision of a possible future. 10 years later, last year, we did a different, I'm sorry for the jumping around, but it does hang together even though we're jumping around. And in this case, it's interesting because 10 years later, we did a different concept of this, in which we made 3. On the left is a amphor with cold work cutting, and we made 3 of them, all virtually the same. And we took a sledgehammer to the second one and the third one. And you can't really tell looking at the picture of the third one, but it's actually been, it was like the second one and has been glued back together. And you can see some of the shards on the table. Go ahead. Focus, unfocus, refocus. It's a slightly more positive riff on the previous piece, but the idea came from a subway ride from Milan to Malpensa Airport, which they opened a second terminal at Malpensa, and they dug a tunnel to run a little train from the first terminal to the second terminal, and they dug up so many Etruscan shards of pottery and so forth, they made an exhibition about it. And you came up the stairs from the subway, and it was beautifully done as in a museum, even though when you got to the top of the stairs it was EasyJet. But still, it was very nicely done. And they had these, very much like this, ceramic, amphor that had been reassembled. And it was a very powerful image, and that's what inspired that piece. So that show in Edinburgh was really quite an experience and a lot of fun. And we had an acquaintance from England down in Kent who came up to visit the show. And she was enthralled by this exhibition, so much so that she went back home. She lived quite near Canterbury. And it so happens that one of her best friends was the Dean of Canterbury Cathedral, Robert Willis. And she waxed eloquently about our Edinburgh experience and said, "Robert, you've got to do something in the cathedral with these people." And there began an extraordinary saga. And I'll tell you more about it, but first, needless to say, we did this. It was a very difficult process, but we did do it, and it was in part centered around the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War. And so we did something in the nave to commemorate the end of the war in 1918. Whoops. Yes, no, that's right. Now, this is a short 2-minute clip. What do I do? Monica, you know how to do you? It's a little. We have to make it go. Yeah. I apologize. I'm a terrible Luddite. Can you hear it? Very good. Will it stop by itself? We go? Yeah. It would be very easy to talk at great length about this piece. All those there's 100 amphors, one for each year since the end of the war. The shape of the boat is the exact same shape as the little peapod that you saw earlier in the palm of the little wooden boat from the Christmas stocking, and it's the same proportional shape as all the other boats we've made, including the one in the gallery. And it was a very complicated thing doing this exhibition. We live 5 hours away by car. We made 32 trips to Canterbury to make that happen. And it nearly didn't happen, but like those things, it did. This is another boat that was in that exhibition. It's placed exactly on what was the tomb of Thomas Becket, who was the famous archbishop who was assassinated in the cathedral. And the cathedral is endlessly fascinating, but this is kind of up at one end of the cathedral, and you go up these stairs. The glass in the boat is meant to be pilgrims. They had this huge funeral for Becket, and political people, religious people from all over Europe came to be there. And you pilgrims who still go there, you go up the steps on your knees and you go around where the tomb was, and 850 years later you can see the dips that the knees of all these people made in the stairs in the cathedral, including all the way around the space, like from where the picture is being taken. And for Monica and me, this notion of pilgrimage and all those people coming on their knees to venerate this spiritual person was a very powerful image. And this boat actually also has found a permanent home with its own room in Ebeltoft, in the Glass Museum in Ebeltoft in Denmark. So, Canterbury is done. It was a big deal. We need a break. But there were some visitors at Canterbury, including Anne and Larry, who brought along a pal of theirs named Anna, who had started a glass gallery with her friend Eileen. And as simple as that, that's why we're standing here today. It's all about synchronicities and what some people erroneously refer to as coincidence. I don't think so. But there was another visitor at the gallery, an old friend of ours who was the director of the Glass Museum in Ebeltoft. And she saw the show and she said, "You got to come and do a show in Ebeltoft." And we thought, sure, why not? So we were thinking about that, and we were thinking, well, what'll we do in Ebeltoft? And we're long subscribers to the journal I'm sure most of you have heard of, called The New Yorker, which is full of cartoons. And literally within a couple of weeks of this offer to go to Ebeltoft, this cartoon showed up in The New Yorker. And it says, "Comet Denier," and one of the dinosaurs says to the other, "That thing's always been there." And we decided to make an exhibition kind of based around comets. So that's a 5.5 meter tall wall. I think it's almost 4 meters wide. And it's called the Comet Wall. It also has some meteors in there for good measure. And when comets hit, they do that. So Ebeltoft is a wonderful little museum, and if you haven't been there, you should go. It's a lot of fun. It's in a beautiful town with a whole lot of nautical history. And part of the museum is in this wonderful old customs house, and then they built a new wing. Well, if I were a head of the architecture school in some university, I'd take the students there to say, now this is what you don't do when you build a building. So we said, what are we going to do with this space? So we decided to sort of create the environment in which comets take place, namely our universe. And there are actually 12 of these steel rods. They represent, in a rather incoherent fashion, the 12 signs of the zodiac, and the glass spheres are the different planets. That's the opposite wall from the one with the comets, and you don't see it very clearly, but there are the 9 planets, and the yellow outline is the sun, and the moon is in the middle. You know, there are 7 days in the week, and they're based on the 7 visible orbs in our solar system. All of this takes place in time. That actually has a little motor, and it's on a pendulum, and it swings back and forth from the top of the museum. How many of you have ever heard of the precession of the equinox? Well, you don't need to be ashamed, because whenever we've asked that question, nobody's ever heard of the precession of the equinox. But it's one of the most fundamental things in the universe. And we won't do the story because we don't have the time, but to give you just a tiny little bit of it, our Earth is like a gyroscope. As we know, it's going 1,000 miles an hour, and it's spinning, 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 and going around in its orbit around the sun. But like a gyroscope, it has a wobble. And the image in the picture shows the wobble. And so it's spinning, 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 but it's wobbling. And to make one wobble through 360 degrees, 72 years to a degree, and it takes just under 26,000 years to complete the wobble. And the wobble, every 2,000 and some years, takes you through one of the signs of the zodiac. So at the end of 26,000 years, you've done a complete cycle of the zodiac. Now, if you go to your history book, they'll say Ptolemy discovered the precession of equinox in the 1st century before Christ. But of course, we now know that Neolithic people knew about precession 9,000 years earlier, at least from Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. How did Neolithic people know about precession of the equinox? Well, for one, I have no idea. Nobody does. But 23,000 years is a long time. And except through observation, how would you figure that out back in the day? That for us was an interesting enough question to create this exhibition. When we described all this to the museum people, they said, well, now wait a minute, Monica and Philip, we're a glass museum. You have to have some glass in this show. And I said, don't worry, there's the comment wall. And we also, to especially honor the requirements, we did this series of 10 pieces. How big are the monoliths? About a meter and something?
Between 90 and 130, I think.
Yeah. They're us. There's a couple, a lovely married couple there in the middle. There's twins over on the right. It's people living in this universe. Once again, we couldn't resist being a little bit reflecting on our times. Again, I'm not going to give you the whole backstory of this, but we had a great friend who was a climbing buddy of mine, and he was a bit of a genius, and he invented the chemical process that made it possible to use PET bottles commercially. They were invented in the 50s, but they only became commercially viable, really, for holding carbonated water and so on in the 70s, thanks to our friend's invention. And our friend, who was a lovely guy, he believed until he died, which is only a few years ago, that his invention was a service to mankind. And we take a slightly different view and rather prefer the bottles on the left to the bottles on the right. So that was a nice exhibition. We went home. This is what? So it was about 5 years ago. Those trees have gotten quite big now. But that's a bit of the view from the studio. And you need a little comic relief. Those are Monica's donkeys. And that's our current team. And this is a good moment to just point out that, as you can surmise listening to all this, it's all about collaboration, you know. Our work that you see in the gallery, it's possible because of those two assistants. We're a team. We get the credit, but they are very accomplished craftspeople and artists in their own right, doing very different work. And we used to get our work, the cutting was done in Venice. And when we moved to Wales, that simply became unrealistic. So we said, okay, we'll train our assistants to do the cutting. And we've been amazingly lucky and have been able to do that. And I think it's one of the greatest things about working in glass, which is that most of the time you're collaborating. So we did Ebeltoft, and that was fun. But we thought, well, maybe we should have a pause. It was in the middle of COVID. We somehow snuck through the wires with COVID and were able to do that show. Anyway, we took a road trip, and we were down in the south of France. And Norman Foster opened a new museum in a little town called Narbonne. Narbonne is just above Perpignan on the Mediterranean coast, and it was a major trading center in the Mediterranean in antiquity in Greek and Roman times. It's a beautiful museum. It only opened 4 or 5 years ago, and we visited it, and it's all about amphor. And about a couple of hours after we were visiting this exhibition, we got a phone call from the director of a museum in France in a village called Conches, about 2 hours west of Paris. And he'd always wanted to do an exhibition with us, and we'd always said, well, I'm not sure. You know, the museum was quite small and not very well funded. And they had just gotten a huge funding. They'd opened a whole new museum, and they wanted us to be the inaugural exhibition. And it was pretty short notice, I think, only about 8 months. And we said, well, we can't turn this down. We'll have to do it. And we said, what could be more perfect? We'll do an exhibition all about amphor. And so we did. And this is the amphor wall. It's 4 meters and something across, about 2.5 meters tall. And there's 257 amphors in there. And we're prejudiced. It's one of our favorite things. Amphor have these pointed bases because they sit in sand in boats, and it holds them stable, and they can travel around the Mediterranean and up rivers and so forth. And while we were building this amphor wall, our neighbor, who knew we were doing this project, he'd come down, he'd see us gradually placing the amphor on the wall, and one day he said, I got to show you something. He said, there's this amazing article in The Guardian this morning, and he brought the newspaper over, and they just discovered that. We didn't copy that. They copied us.
Where was that?
Off the coast of Greece, in some island in the Aegean.
It's just a wooden boat.
That had the boat had disintegrated, and the cargo remained. Yeah, it's very recent. It's maybe 2022. So this show was all about amphor, and at this point we needed to do some homework. You know, we needed to learn more about amphor. And this is an amphor from a site in the Indus River Valley, and it's a civilization that was only discovered in 1922. And it's parallel to Egypt and Mesopotamia. And we thought this was a very beautiful form, and we had to do something with it. But it's also extraordinary because this Harappan civilization is an anomaly. It's not like Mesopotamia and Egypt. It's not hierarchical. It's laid out like the streets of Manhattan, very egalitarian buildings, no temples, apparently no priesthood. And so the Harappans remain, they date from about 3000 to 1500 BC, and they were overrun by the Aryans who came down and essentially took over India. But they remain a very fascinating culture precisely because of what archaeologists now genuinely do believe was a very different society. It's great because we did these 7 pieces in honor of those amphor, and 2 of them are are next door in the gallery. You know, something about these forms is they have this endless quality that keeps coming back. And you find it in South America. They've found them even 10,000 years BC. They're ubiquitous. This is more amphor. These are meant to be Greek amphor. We call them the Aristotelians, and they're very rational geometric shapes honor Aristotle's contribution to rational thought. So, that was a little quicker than I meant to go. At the time we were making these pieces, Russia invaded the Ukraine. And we thought, oh boy, this is a bummer. We said, we need to somehow bring this into the show. So we did. And there are several protagonists in this unfortunate affair. Obviously Russia. There are two Russias, Lenin, Stalin, and Putin on one side, but there's another Russia on the other side of that same vase. And then there are these people. No. And it's a very disturbing object because it's, I think, a very beautiful object. But as you can see, the bullets face inward and they face outward. And we won't get into the relationship of that vase to the other ones. But there's also a fourth participant, a more discreet participant. This amphor is also from about 5000 BC. The Bampo culture in what I think would be today Manchuria. Not only is it a beautiful amphor, but as you can see, it has batuto cutting on it. 5,000, 7,000 years before we were doing it. How did they dare do that? Anyway, we thought that was a particularly beautiful amphor, so we did a China amphor based on that. So one side of it shows the amphor, China 5,000, 6,000 years ago, and China today. It's not in any way meant to be polemical. Simply, there's a culture that's been around so much longer than ours that what goes on today must appear to them like just a blip on the horizon. Anyway, how are we doing with time?
Almost 40 minutes.
Okay, we're doing all right. This is a bit of a non sequitur, but not really. This is a piece that was done for Canterbury Cathedral. It's called the People's Wall. And it's there are approximately 750 glass objects in it, amphor-like objects. And it's been placed in the International Museum of the Red Cross in Geneva. And it was a very happy occasion in spite of all of the implications in that piece. It's meant as a happy piece. It was the last thing you would see at Canterbury Cathedral at the end of the show. And it's meant to convey that we're all in this together. In this context, at the Red Cross Museum, it dovetails with a lot of their philosophy. And it's placed in the entrance to the museum, and approximately where we're sitting, where the picture is taken, there's this very beautiful wood wall, textured wood wall. And you go through a little door into a kind of darkened library behind this wood wall. And it is a cartotheque, how would we say that? Card files. Shelves and shelves and shelves of card files. And it's the card files of the 5 million prisoners of war from the end of the First World War. And if you get to Geneva, go see it. It's very, very powerful. And yeah, we were deeply grateful that this piece could be placed there. There you see a bit of the detail of it. One more exhibition after all this, also in Switzerland. The intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant. We have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift. It's attributed to Albert Einstein. It might just, even if it's not certain that it's Albert Einstein, he said so many things in his life that mirror that quote, that it's appropriate to him. And that is kind of what we think, what he says there. So we made a piece that would represent the rational mind on the left and the intuitive mind on the right. I'm sorry we don't have a more detailed picture of that here today, but we don't. It's a rational society, right? That's what we live in? Are you sure? Are you confident? I don't think so. Something's out of whack. Anyway, we're virtually at the end, and we'll conclude with one more thing. That's our assistant, Philomen. It's just to show you what we put our assistants through. I can assure you she volunteered for the job with great enthusiasm. And she's in an aquarium. And we set up an aquarium, a big aquarium, full of archaeological objects. And the title of the piece is, hang on, Monica Guggisberg, Baldwin, 4000 AD. Have I got that right? It's meant to be us in about, who knows, maybe next week, but maybe it'll be a few years. Because that's where it all ends up. And that's it. So, I was so worried about it being too long that I cut out about a third of the talk. But we can. I think we have a little time if you want to ask some questions or. Yes.
Well, I have a question. I love that installation in Coventry, in
Canterbury.
In Canterbury, yes, in Canterbury Cathedral. The ship form with all those 100 hanging
Yes.
amphora. But what happened to that afterwards? Did you
Well,
find a permanent home for it, or
Yes.
did you take it apart and sort of?
It's
sell
a
them
very
up
good
above?
question, and I'm glad you brought it up, because I think there are some architects in the room. But anyway,
We've also
these.
thought about a different way, rather than hang them, to actually make sort of archaeological site and sort of put them in the ground, and make sort of the shape of a boat. A little bit
Some of these things take a long
So
time.
that's sort of the direction we're at the moment.
So there was the boat you saw at the earlier cathedral. Well, that boat is 9 meters long, and it went to about 10 different places around Europe over a period of 8 or 9 years, and it found a home in a museum.
But it did take a while.
But it took a while, and you need to get funding for these things. And the other boat in Ebeltoft, okay, that was much smaller. It was only 3 meters, but it had been in Canterbury, and it ended up staying in another museum. In the case of Canterbury, that boat is 20 meters long, and
Quite a commitment to place.
A lot of space.
Yeah.
we nearly placed it. It was a close call in Liverpool Street train station in London. And I'm kind of glad we didn't. It would have been a come down. But
Too commercial.
we are in touch with a person in London who does a lot of public exhibition work and so forth. And if we can hang in there long enough, hopefully we'll find a home for it. I suppose one of the things I perhaps would have liked to have said is that there is, in all of this work, there's this impermanence. And these objects are absolutely, we think they're beautiful. And they are here today and gone tomorrow. So we savor them in the moment. And it's this installation with the goldfish and so forth. We were lucky. We had an acquaintance who does aquariums. It's very complicated aquariums. We had no idea. And anyway, he put these little baby goldfish in there. And the show, they loved it. And they grew, by the end of the exhibition, they were this big. Anyway. I think if there aren't any questions, we might.
To the gallery.
Yeah.
Look at the exhibition.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Tack.
Thank you.